It's a great pleasure to be at Stanford, and particularly a pleasure to be bringing together on campus some of the, I guess, most passionate advocates of accelerating female and minority careers, and it's terrific to be part of that energy. What I want to do to open our evening is to essentially go through just some of the highlights of this research and show some of the actions on the ground, because one of the things we're committed to in this task force is creating some traction. It's not just research that stays on shelves, but something that should spur real change on the ground. And the 22 examples of emerging best practice that have come out of this research is probably the thing I'm most proud of. But let me start with a little story, because I think it helps focus our minds on why this topic is so important. In 2003, my oldest son graduated college. A totally normal event, and all kinds of, smiling parents and normal kinds of joy at the occasion. I was particularly pleased because we have 4 children. It was the prospect of, getting a child finally into the paying workforce was a pretty happy occasion. But aside from the normal kind of joys of that weekend, the thing that really sticks in my mind is the face of the class of 2003 at Yale College. This is what it looked like. 53% female, 35% persons of color. In other words, white guys were about a third of those folks graduating that year. And as I looked at the stage and drank in the, those radiant, fresh, young, talented faces, I profoundly understood how the face of opportunity had changed in this country. Because just think of it, when I came to the States and I was an immigrant from Wales in the UK, Yale was 100% male, 1% persons of color. This was in the very early 70s. And the big outstanding question of the day was how big the Jewish quota should be. So I felt the pride of a nation that had changed the face of opportunity to that degree, it almost gave you goose pimples. But I was also very much in tune with another reality, because I'd been writing on it and researching on it, how poorly prepared we were as an economy, as a nation, as a private sector, to fully utilize this talent that was in front of me. I knew that unless things changed quite a bit in terms of our career models, way too many of those people in front of me would end up either leaving or languishing. And I think that is a kind of reminder of what is at stake here. The other just footnote in terms of this graduation, 76% of the prizes and awards that particular day went to women. And I think the achievement gap is really out there. Women are doing incredibly well in our educational pipeline. So let's go to the research, and I'll tell you a little tiny bit about the task force. It began in the winter of 2003, 2004, a small band of true believers, 6 corporations that were committed to the notion of going the next step and not just providing access and opportunity, but also putting in place the structures that allowed the realization of that talent over the lifespan, over the long haul. And it was this kind of second generation of policies that the task force committed to tackle. The task force since that date has expanded to being 33 corporations. They range from, British Petroleum to Goldman Sachs to Cisco to Intel to J&J, GE. These are very large actors on the global stage. In fact, the companies between them employ 3 million people and operate in 150 countries. So it has grown, and it has garnered commitment as it's, I guess, dug a fairly substantial path over these last 3 years. So what have we looked at in terms of the challenges out there? Well, the first challenge we looked at was the whole issue of whether women were dropping out or not. And if you remember, 3 years ago, Lisa Belkin did that very famous article in the New York Times, which reverberated around the country, which was bemoaning the kind of opt-out revolution, as she called it. There was a lot of anger around that research because a lot of working women felt that she had looked at way to an elite group and, in fact, was not reflective of reality. But I guess what we were concerned with was finally creating the data that allowed us to know what was actually happening. Because a lot of the media frenzy was around anecdote stories. It really was not about data. So let me just walk you through what became our off-ramps, on-ramps study published in the Harvard Business Review in March '05. This gives you a sense of the range of companies in the task force. And this was the basic survey research. We did a lot of qualitative research too, which underlay the off-ramps, on-ramps article. So the first finding was, hey guys, women do in fact take an off-ramp, but it is not copping out, opting out, dropping out. 37% of highly credentialed women will take a short break, but the average amount of time spent outside the labor force is really very short. It hovers around 2 years, depending on what sector you look at. And after that time period, something like 93% of women are trying to get back in. The other major finding, when you look at why women are pulled out, there's a very complex set of reasons. I mean, we thought everyone thinks that it's kind of children. Well, in fact, children are very important. 45% of women do off-ramp for a child-related reasons, but there's a whole flood of other reasons. Elder care, for instance, accounts for 24% of the problem. And as well as these factors which pull women out, that is the work of care, there's a whole bunch of factors that push from the workplace. In other words, if women are underutilized, if they're passed over for promotion, if they feel that they're not being appreciated on the job, they often take themselves out for reasons which are really a result of factors at work, really, rather than factors at home. What we uncovered in the research was this kind of complex interaction between push and pull. If bad stuff's going on at work, your 2-year-old looks a whole lot more appealing. And in real life, the decision to off-ramp is often a complex interaction between push and pull factors. There's a kind of cascading reality that happens. And obviously, this puts a lot of responsibility back on the shoulders of the employer, because if you can create a very supportive and I guess, fully engaged work context, the odds are many women will figure out how to deal well with what is also going on at home. And therefore, there's a lot of kind of agency, I think, that employers have. When we look at why women come back in so quickly, it's not a mystery. Many women in our economy have very serious financial responsibilities for themselves, for their families. So the financial pressures is, 50% of the reasons. But there are a bunch of other reasons which we also are very in touch with, which is that women love their work. This is something that is often ignored in articles about opting out, but work really sits at the core of identity these days. It provides meaning and purpose, standing and status in community, and even professional women currently off-ramped see their professional identities as the core identity in their lives. Often perhaps a joint one with a family role, but it's really way up there in terms of how they see themselves, how they craft their self-esteem. Some of the most depressing data in this study is around the on-ramping reality. It's incredibly difficult to get back on board a career. And this is despite the fact that women are taking actually rather little time out. As you can see, 93% are trying to get back in, only 74% make it, and then only 40% actually end up in mainstream full-time jobs. And then there is also the financial penalties. Even if you manage to get that job back in your sector, in the mainstream, the odds are you will be paid significantly less than when you left. And if you look at some of the data when you've been out, say, 5 years, it's very distressing just how much income you lose because of this off-ramp. The other thing that you lose out on is ambition. We find that as women hit their mid-late 30s, there is a significant drop in aspiration and in ambition, and the gap between men and women starts to widen very considerably. A lot of it is because of these discontinuities in careers. If you've taken an off-ramp and find it incredibly hard to get back in, you know, you're not a masochist. You hit your head against that hard wall a few times, and the odds are you redefine your expectations for yourself. So that there's this downsizing of ambition that starts happening too, which is yet another cost of the, the non-linear career. So what do we do with all of this data? And of course, a lot of the energy of the task force is centered on solutions. First of all, the kind of major takeaway. If you add together the women who off-ramp with women who take what I call scenic routes, a little bit of flex time, a little bit of telecommuting, a little bit of, say, reduced hour working, which often takes you off succession planning tables, for instance. If you add together those two groups, you will find that something like 60% or a little bit more than 60% of women who have lots of credentials these days exhibit these non-linear careers. They find it exceedingly difficult to kind of conjure up the lockstep, continuous, cumulative pattern, which is such a hallmark of the white male competitive model. In other words, cloning the male competitive model, which is what gets you success in this economy, is extremely difficult for about 2/3 of women. And therefore, 40 years after the women's revolution, really transformed female opportunities, we still have a situation where women's work lives are very differently patterned from men. They're laden with penalties and really explain why it is still so difficult to get to the top, or at least why the number of women who get to the top is still a very small percentage. What we then did, obviously, with all of this data and perhaps some of these insights, is put together a package of, I know it's got 5 here, we actually in the end created 6 because there was a very specific work-life takeaway here. But there are 6 areas of policies which any organization or any company needs to get traction around if we are to transform the prospects for women. First of all, rich programs of flexibility. One of the examples that we have worked with over the last few years is Ernst & Young, which has improved its flexibility to an extent that they now have 13 different ways you can work flexibly. And they reckon that once you get past the 25% mark, once 25% of your professionals are working flexibly, it becomes normal. It's no longer a stigmatized reality, especially if you figure out how to promote people on flexible schedules, which they seem to have done at this company. So there are examples out there, and we are obviously in the business of accelerating these programs where there are exceedingly effective programs of flexibility, which means that many fewer women need to off-ramp in the first place. The second type of flexibility we have authored and talk about a lot is what I call arc of the career flexibility. And I think an example is going to be talked about this evening because Carla, I think, is going to share with us what Booz Allen has done on this front. One example which I'll bring from New York is that Lehman Brothers recently created a program called Encore, which deliberately seeks to welcome back to the financial sector women who've left, women who have been out anywhere between 2 and 5 years. That's the parameter. This program not only gives these women a little reskilling, access to the lateral hiring pool, but offers kind of nuggets of part-time work, which allows them to ramp up gradually. This program is just 16 months old. Already there are over 200 women involved in this. They've rolled it out in London as well as New York, and plan on rolling it out in Tokyo in the new year. Some of these issues of gender and women's advancement obviously trump nationality and are presenting challenges in nations all around the world. So that is a powerful mechanism for creating better on-ramps. The third thing we have tackled is reimagining work life. I'll just give you one set of figures. 40% of professional women don't have biological children. Everyone has a parent. And there's tremendously inadequate benefit, supports and programs around elder care in this country. And for almost 25% of women, that is the reason that they're pushed out of their careers. So trying to be inclusive, trying to address what are really the urgent issues of your workforce means that you've got to look at extended family, you've got to look at elder care, and clearly in multicultural and minority areas, you need to look very hard at the needy circle that is often on the shoulders of the female professional. Now, we wish that wasn't so completely true, but much of this care, like 80% of the elder care burden, is taken up by women rather than men. So widening the tent, making sure that you are supporting the work of care that is really going on in your professional workforce is very important. The fourth thing is getting rid of stigma. In our work, we find that, for over 50% of women, they don't take policies that are on the books because there is so much stigma attached to, say, job sharing or telecommuting or flexibility or any of the other things that really might help them out. Many women feel that it's the kiss of death in terms of being viewed as a serious professional, that it's contaminating, to use a word that popped up in an interview just last week. So how do you get rid of the stigma? And I know that there's stigma here at Stanford. We were talking about it today. It's very hard, I understand, to extend the tenure clock here because folks who do that are seen as second-class citizens or not serious or not players or something or other. So I think it's not just the private sector. It's really, right across our high echelon workforce that we have to worry about this. One thing we found in the task force that mainstreaming some of these policies, there's two ways to do it. First of all, you can get your leaders to actually take this stuff. My example is Neil Fitzgerald, the CEO of Unilever, who very famously telecommuted on Fridays for 2 whole years and in very loud and obvious ways had breakfast with his daughter and did not make appointments before 9:30, not because he had a desperate need to share this with the world, but he knew they would make a huge difference to everyone else if the CEO did it. And I think that it's an incredible message for our leaders, whether they be male or female, that they start trying to do these things. I still remember when Tony Blair had his 4th child and very famously did not take any parenting leave. There was a huge uproar in London because he missed out on the opportunity for showcasing that as something that was an important thing to do. So walking the talk at the top is a very effective way of getting rid of stigma. But another way of doing it is positioning these policies as policies that enhance performance, enhance productivity, and sustainability. And I'll give you an example. Nani is, I think, going to mention what she's doing at Cisco a little later on. But for instance, we found that at Lehman Brothers, again, a firm that's been quite imaginative on this front, they decided to position flexibility as part of their catastrophic response program. This was a firm that got knocked out by 9/11. They lost a building. And in the wake of that, they got very serious about putting real money into remote technology and about figuring out ways of encouraging particularly powerful senior folks to spend part of the time remote working in ways that were celebrated. And when the pandemic scare rolled down the pike, 18 months ago, Lehman actually created a program which is now their response to any big threat, geopolitical threat of terrorism, whatever. And flexibility is positioned under that umbrella. So it's not seen as an accommodation to women's lives, but a strategic geopolitical imperative. And that's pretty clever because, again, it tends to get it out of the pink-collar ghetto. It tends to make it be seen as a business imperative. So the stigmatization, deal can be quite complex, but it can work. And the final thing I want to talk about is providing outlets for altruism. And let me give you a little backdrop on this. In our research, what we can show is that women's ambitions are different from men's. For instance, 5 or 6 elements in terms of what motivates you, what gets you to work every day, 5 or 6 elements, depending on sector, trump money as a motivating force. For women, working with high-caliber colleagues in teams, recognition, huge. Flexibility, huge. Giving back to society, giving back to community, giving back to neighborhood, or giving back to your organization, all huge. And finally, meaning and purpose in what you do. All of those are more important than money. Not that money isn't essential. Women in particular want to be fairly paid. If they wake up one morning and find that a male colleague is being paid more for the same work, they certainly can get very unhappy. And as I was mentioning before, there are breadwinning, standard and often very significant constraints in these lives. But it's extremely important to understand all this other stuff, because if you're a manager of female talent, or if you're a high-performing woman, you know that these things will help you be attached to a career, to an employer, to an organization. Because this is why you are, trading your choices the way you are. Because when we look at women, we find that they have a higher bar. For many women, there are significant opportunity costs in going to work. You are passing up a whole bunch of things you might be doing if you made other choices. And so that you do not do it just for money. You do it for a bunch of very rich things. So an organization that can tap into this altruism, tap into these other motivating factors, does become a winner in terms of its ability to retain and realize and create the kind of full engagement that we are talking about this evening. So there's a whole bunch of kind of to-dos here, and the good news is that over the last 3 years we have created 22 emerging models. I've talked about a few of them. We're going to hear about some more in a minute. And I guess what I'm going to do now is just, I think, fast forward a little bit. There is a big study called Leadership in Your Midst, which I will just mention, not exactly briefly, but not perhaps as in such detail as off-ramps, on-ramps. And I also want to talk about a research project which is going to be launched next month at the New York Stock Exchange called Extreme Jobs, because it's a real follow-on from off-ramps and on-ramps. But first, leadership in your midst, and I will just perhaps not go through the PowerPoint, but give you a little bit of an overarching view of what that was about. In this research, we went into the kind of national context. We did a big national survey, but we also did a global one. We went into South Africa, India, and Europe. And the question was, what is different? What is particularly challenging about the career paths of minority professionals? And there were really kind of three big takeaways. First of all, these lives are very rich in cultural capital, which is connection to community, connection to religious organizations, neighborhood, and social outreach. Compared with Caucasian leaders, and I'm not trying to say that they don't do a bunch of things too, there is, I think, more sense of standing on the shoulders of, villages, communities who have lifted you up and therefore a need to give back. But it's also, I think, a sense of seeking, this meaning and purpose, this set of altruistic goals which we saw earlier in the off-ramps, on-ramps research. So whether it's South Africa or India or the US, 40–50% of these professionals are heavily involved in these activities, and that in a way represents a set of transferable skills that they could potentially bring back to their organization, to their firm. But because it's real hard to share this stuff, the issues of trust, issues of it being used against them, issues of negative stereotypes, because perhaps if I'm involved in homeless shelters or HIV/AIDS, it kind of rubs off in me and makes me look like I'm alien or other. There's a real failure of being able to bring your whole self to work, being able to bring your whole identity to work, and therefore these stories and this reality is a kind of well-kept secret. 3/4 of these professionals were saying that they were not talking about it to colleagues, to bosses, and therefore it kind of cut off a whole rich vein of potential. It's a very celebratory story. I mean, for instance, in our international survey, we found that 15% of personal income was sent back, not in terms of, repatriation to family, but to the community, to, girl power projects or irrigation or HIV/AIDS, just the most amazing altruism showing up in these lives. The second tranche of data, and again, this is out there in the research that was published last fall in the Harvard Business Review. Subtle bias is alive and well. These days, obviously, very overt prejudice is illegal. It's probably pretty hard to find. But what we found that it was kind of death by 1,000 cuts. It's tone of voice, it's hand gestures, it's accent. But particularly for minority females, it adds up to a pounding in terms of discrimination. And in fact, in our national data, something like 19% of minority women were on the verge of quitting because of what was happening in their large organization on this front, and the figure was 43% in our global companies data, which was the international data. So out of this research, which I think was very rich in both some celebratory asset-building research, as well as, I think, a refinement of some of the most challenging data on bias and discrimination, there is, I think, a lot of insight and, again, a whole bunch of new models that we're beginning to tangle with. I'm very eager to allow good time for the panelists, so let me just give you a nugget of the research that's being launched next month. In extreme jobs, which the subtitle is The Dangerous Allure of the 70-Hour Week, it probably describes a lot of your lives. What we did is we mapped what has happened to high-impact, high-level jobs in the global economy. Again, we have a big US data gathering exercise and a big international one. So what is an extreme job, and you know, why do I claim that it's ratcheting up out there? Our definition of an extreme job is a job that has at least 60 hours a week in terms of on-the-job requirements, and has at least five other performance pressures, which range from, you know, 24/7 client demands, global travel, P&L responsibility, huge, say, mentoring responsibilities these days. I mean, we identified through focus groups, you know, 10 commonly felt very burdensome pressures. If you have 5 of them plus a 60-hour week, you get to be an extreme worker in this data set. Now, guess what? In our global companies survey, fully 45% of professionals have extreme jobs these days. On average, they were working 16 hours more than 5 years ago, as hours per week. And I think that what I'm describing is probably something you see all around you. It's certainly true of academia, as we discovered in our figures. Some of the surprises of the research were first that people more or less love their extreme jobs. 70% of those that hold them are totally enamored of them. The adrenaline rush, you know, the sense of prestige that those jobs get in our culture, where we see these jobs as very virtuous. You know, people boast about their 70-hour weeks and their 400,000 miles that they, you know, racked up last year. So it comes with a lot of glamour. But as you might imagine, there is a lot of risk and a lot of unsustainability attached to these jobs. And it's also true that they're leaving women behind in new ways. Because what has happened is that we've moved the goalpost. Jobs really have become more pressurizing, more burdensome, more exhilarating, and more doable by individuals who do not have serious other responsibilities in their lives. When we look at women to see what is happening to them in relationship to extreme jobs, we find that very few women opt into them, and they also opt out of them rather readily. Now, that does not bode well for the future, because companies see this group of workers as their bench strength for leadership, you know, their A-team, and increasingly women are finding it incredibly hard to stay attached, you know, to the extreme job model for reasons which are fairly obvious. The other thing we played out was the impact on health, the impact on family. And there's a very interesting difference between men and women in terms of the connect between an extreme job and children. Men actually see that, you know, children might not be thriving, you know, they're not getting enough attention, they're eating too much junk food, they're underachieving at school, etc., etc., but they don't tend to connect it to their own behavior. Whereas women draw a straight line from their 70-hour week job and something that's going wrong in their child's life. And some of that data is almost a kind of portrait of guilt. And it helps explain why women tend to avoid these very long-hour jobs, at least for that short period of their lives where family responsibilities are particularly intense. We found, for instance, that women are not afraid of hard work, responsibility, client demands, or global travel. They can't deal with the 70-hour weeks, at least for chunks of their life. And I guess what this data is beginning to tell us is that it makes our off-ramps, on-ramps research even more powerful, because it shows that you know, well, I'll put it in context. You know, for 30 or 40 years, we just stood around and I think hoped that women would get with the program. Somehow they would just learn to clone this male competitive model. Give them enough time, you know, the pipeline would fill, and we'd solve the problem of representation at top by women. Well, obviously that's not happened, because as it turns out, 60% of them can't conjure up that, you know, linear lockstep thing. And remember when Larry Summers made his, you know, much talked about speech a couple of years ago, he talked about two things, not just about the genetic inferiority of women in the sciences. He also talked about how women couldn't hack it because they failed to conjure up, he said, the 80-hour weeks that were necessary for success in science. But rather than kind of blaming the women for not being able to shoehorn themselves into this model, I mean, the clever thing is to create some other models that fit the profile of women's lives. Because, you know, women have enormous commitment. This is the center of their identities. They're desperate to find a way of doing both things. So I think that what this research shows us, that moving the goalpost means that we can expect a future where even more women, because the work model is actually getting more extreme, will need to take an off-ramp for a short period of time, or will need a scenic route. We're also probably describing a future where men, particularly young men married to career women, are going to need that too. So this is perhaps newly normal, newly standard, and I think that it is a challenge that we're not going to be able to avoid.